One of the more fascinating and disturbing aspects of the Gaza war is the fact that so many people really, really, really want to believe that Israel is guilty of genocide. It's really very important to people, even though to any reasonable observer, it's an absolutely absurd accusation. And the ICJ itself has said that it's not true. And yet people really, really, really want to believe that it is true. So what's going on? My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, let's back up a little. People have been accusing Israel of genocide for decades, at least as long as I can remember. It's certainly long, long before October 7th. Indeed, I remember, I think it was 2003, I was in London for work, and I was in a very posh, it wasn't even a pub, it was more like a cafe, brasserie sort of thing in the St. John's Woods neighborhood of London. So we're talking high end. And I was surrounded by people who ultimately were just sort of white yuppies. And there was this young man who started explaining to me that what Israel did to Palestinians was the same as what the Nazis did to Jews. I confess I was absolutely flabbergasted. I mean, to make such a statement, it bespoke both profound ignorance, both of the Holocaust and of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And frankly, it told me that this guy was a dick. And for once in my life, I really had no idea what to say. The man's comments underscore an essential point that I hate to have to spell out, but here we are, so I'm going to spell it out. Any accusation that Israel is guilty of genocide is explicitly or implicitly a comparison between Israel's actions and the Holocaust. One is saying that what Israel is doing is the same as the Holocaust, that Israelis are the same as Nazis. Israel is the same as Nazi Germany. After all, the genocide statutes, which I believe were written by Jews, was a direct response to the Holocaust. And the fact of the matter is that that Jews were the primary victim of the Holocaust, and they are the ones being accused of genocide in this case. Plus, like, let's think about it. The very word genocide, the very concept, really has everything to do with the Holocaust. And when people hear the word genocide, they ultimately think about the Holocaust. Nobody immediately thinks about Rwanda or the Rohingya or Cambodia or anything like that. I mean, yeah, that's all true. And people say, yeah, those two were genocides. But the comparison, again, implicitly and explicitly, is the Holocaust. I think people might deny this, but frankly, they're kidding themselves, or they're just straight up lying. Indeed, anytime one scratches the surface even just a little bit, you find this comparison being made really very, very starkly. Just recently, the French politician Mélenchon commented about how he said something along the lines of how the Hamas in Gaza was like, these were like the Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which is it's a grotesque comparison. But all the time people say this, and this is where you get the Zion Nazi thing and the Israel equals Nazis and all sorts of stuff. It's ultimately this comparison. In some cases, the charge that Israel is guilty of genocide really represents a form of Holocaust denial, because what you're really saying is that if Israel does exactly what the Nazis did, or what Israel's doing is the same as what the Nazis did, then basically what you're saying is that what the Nazis did really wasn't as bad as people like to think. Also, implicitly, you're sort of suggesting that maybe the Jews were guilty of something, right? So they weren't that innocent, or they weren't really the victims that we'd like to think that they were, or ultimately the Holocaust really wasn't as bad. That's really the only way you could possibly make that comparison. And of course, Holocaust denial, besides being disgusting, is ahistorical. It's factually incorrect. The Holocaust is one of the most incredibly well-documented crimes in all of history. And in many jurisdictions, it's also illegal, but that's what people are doing. I think for others, what's going on is the expression of some sort of cognitive dissonance, some sort of like shock between the reality of the situation and what people want to believe is actually the case. I think that for people in the pro-Palestinian camp, the atrocities of 7 October were so shocking that it becomes necessary to invert it. You have to invert the accusation. It's not Hamas that wants genocide. It's not the Palestinians who did such a terrible thing, because ultimately it's Israel. They're the monsters. It's the Jews who are the monsters. So you got to turn it around, because otherwise you have to admit that their side is capable of being monstrous at a level that I think pains people to actually acknowledge. Nobody wants to admit that their own side is guilty of things, or that their side is capable of being monstrous. Now, I'll give you a concrete example. In Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area, the ringleader of the most vociferous pro-Hamas and anti-Israel protests is a woman named Hazama Barmati. And she said something really very revealing in an interview a few months ago, an interview that I think was clearly intended to be a puff piece. She said something really remarkable. And I'm quoting from the interview here. She says, so the article says, she has a 15-month-old son. And for her, October 7th marked a turning point, right? Quote, this is her. For a long time, the Palestinian identity, even for me, was something that I wouldn't say I'm ashamed of. I'm very proud to be Palestinian, but I contained my identity and was very particular about where I would choose to be proudly Palestinian. She explains. Again, the quote continues. On the 7th of October, so the 7th of October, so we're not talking about later when the actual fighting was starting. She says, when I saw the visceral and horrendous response that was completely disproportionate, but also the dehumanization of Palestinians, I said, my son is Palestinian. How am I going to be telling him to be proud of who he is if I can't step into the full reality of who I am? She says, and something in me broke. I think what she's saying is this. I want my son to be proud to be Palestinian. I want to be proud of Palestinian, but then in October, something happened that I really can't be proud of. This is really horrendous. So how do I cope with this? Well, psychologically, what I need to do is basically deny it and flip it around and say, no, I have to say forthright that no, it's the Israelis who are the monsters, the Israelis who are committing genocide, not Hamas. It's not Hamas that did this. The real crime is what Israel does. So again, there's a psychological inversion. And it's really remarkable that she's identifying this change of this frame of mind with October 7th, what she witnessed on October 7th. So she has to do this psychologically. And by the way, during a protest that she led in my neighborhood, I spoke with some of the people who were part of her protest group, and I asked them back to October 7th, and they said, oh, none of it actually happened. The atrocities, the rapes, like none of that actually happened. These are all lies, right? So you've got to deny it, and then you got to invert it. We're not the criminals. We're not the monsters. It's the other people who are the monsters. I mean, psychologically, this is very important if you're in the pro-Palestinian camp to be able, for some people, to be able to say, it's not us, it's them. I think a key part of this also is that in the post-Holocaust world, there has been a global consensus that really there's nothing as monstrous and nothing as evil as the Holocaust or as genocide. So people like Barmati needs to resort to that word. You're going to use the genocide word. It reminds me a bit about how, in the English language, the American English language, there's a C word that for Americans is really the worst possible word that you could possibly use. Although, from what I understand, in England, they use the word fairly casually. In America, you don't ever use the C word unless you really, really, really want to get some shock value. It's got such resonance. So you're going to resort to that word. It's like our verbal nuclear option. So here it is. You're going to use the C word, the G word. You're going to accuse somebody of genocide because genocide is understood to be the greatest of all evils. In the post-1945 world, so genocide is the greatest of all sins, the greatest of all civilizational failures, and Nazis are symbols of the greatest of all evil, right? And this is why they're so useful in cinema, because everybody agrees, like Nazis make the perfect villains because they're the ultimate villain. Jews, who were, of course, the primary victims of the Holocaust, then are elevated to, for better or for worse, to the ultimate victim. So the Nazis are the ultimate evildoers, and the Jews are the ultimate victim because they were the primary target of these evil people. Now, the bad part about this kind of elevation into sort of perfect ultimate victimhood is that this also makes them targets. It makes them themselves, Jews, become lightning rods for all sorts of ludicrous associations and accusations. Contemporary enemies of the Jews, Hamas being, of course, a great example, but also Hamas supporters, I think have found it necessary to take Jews down several notches as well, because if you're advocating a position that ultimately favors violence against Jews who have been understood to be the perfect victim, you need to be able to say, well, they're not really the perfect victim because the crime against them either wasn't that bad or ultimately they are the evil people. They are the perpetrators of this greatest of all crime. And now the idea is to try to elevate Palestinians to be like the alternative. It's not the Jew who's the perfect victim. It's really the Palestinian who's the perfect victim. I think that for non-Jews, also accusing Jews of genocide is a way of dealing with a sense of collective guilt. the world collectively holds a great deal of responsibility for the Holocaust. Of course, the Nazis are the ones who were responsible, but a lot of other people were involved. They were implicit, complicit, they collaborated, or they simply did absolutely nothing and stood by. And so some people, I think, do feel some sort of sense of responsibility or collective guilt. An amazingly powerful way of dealing with that responsibility is, again, by inverting the accusation, by saying that not only are Jews just as bad as the Nazis, you're saying that they might in fact be worse, or at least worse than those of us. They're as bad as we are, and they might actually be worse because we didn't commit genocide. We being collectively, right? That the sort of non-Jews who might feel some sort of sense of collective guilt. So this is a way of exonerating themselves in this very sort of strange, messed up way, by saying, Jews aren't really that good. Jews are as evil as the Nazis. So therefore, none of us should really feel guilty for anything about that, any aspect of the Holocaust, anything that happened to them. I think that there's also something to be said about the transgressive nature, even just of accusing Jews of genocide. We see this in Trump rallies, right? So if you watch videos of Trump rallies, there's this dynamic that goes on where Trump will say something outrageous and the crowd will go wild. They'll be completely ecstatic. And then this, of course, feeds Trump, who will then say even more outrageous things and the crowd becomes even more ecstatic. So there's this weird ecstasy that goes on. Just simply by transgression. So transgressing taboos, saying things that heretofore were not acceptable to say, there's this weird electric charge that comes from it. And I really suspect that a lot of people actually, frankly, get off on this kind of accusation. They've derived some sort of sense of ecstasy or satisfaction in accusing Jews of genocide. The notion, moreover, that Jews are the worst kinds of people, that they're guilty of the worst, greatest evil that our society recognizes, of course, dovetails very nicely with old school Christian anti-Judaism and to a lesser extent Muslim anti-Jewish polemics. At least that's what Martin Luther said, and Martin Luther was neither the first nor the last Christian theologian to say such things. And the idea basically is that Jews, because they reject Christ, therefore they are not only wicked, but they become the embodiments of all that is wicked, of all that is contrary to Christ, and all that is evil. This, of course, relates to what happens with the Enlightenment, too. With Voltaire, Voltaire argued that human progress meant the embrace of these universal values that everybody's supposed to share, and this is supposed to herald human progress. We're living some sort of wonderful teleology to some sort of rational utopian state, except for the Jews being the holdouts, the Jews who are stubbornly resisting and by their insistence on being different, and that they then, in Voltaire's mind, become the embodiments of evil, of everything that is retrograde, of everything that is contrary to the Enlightenment. Therefore, Voltaire says, they are evil, and that's the language that he uses. This is where left-wing anti-Semitism comes from, because left-wing anti-Semitism ultimately identifies Jews with evil because it defines Jews or associates Jews with all of the values and behaviors that are deemed contrary to whatever the dogma du jour happens to be, whether you're a communist or a Marxist or this or that. But the notion is that we would all be great if it weren't for those Jews. And the fact that the Jews are there, then, the Juden sind unser Unglück, said the 19th century German historian, a motto which became very popular in Nazi Germany. Jews are a misfortune because they are embodiments of evil. And how do you mark somebody's evil in our society? Well, you accuse them of the greatest of all crimes, which is genocide. It reminds me quite a bit of the medieval accusation that's levied against Jews. In medieval Europe, people commonly accuse Jews of desecrating the host, the host being the crackers or the wafers that priests would consume and transubstantiate into the body of Christ. So there were all these allegations that Jews were somehow mutilating or desecrating these crackers. Of course, this is a completely absurd accusation, but people really believe this, and they'd get all riled up, and then they'd go massacre Jews. Medieval historians have documented how the desecration of the host accusation very clearly reflects anxiety on the part of the accusers, anxieties that are festering at the heart of European Christendom. It's about anxiety, it's about insecurity, it's about fear. And so they're lashing out and they're projecting, and it all sort of takes this bizarre form of accusing Jews of desecrating hosts. I think that this is all a very long-winded way of saying that the accusation that Israel is guilty of genocide ultimately says more about the accusers than it does about Israel. But this has always been the case with anti-Semitism. It always says more about the psychology, the psychological turmoil of the accuser, of the anti-Semite, than it does have to say about the reality of the Jews. Please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Also check out my Substack, Pax Americana, the link in the description. You can also come find me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and check out my website, michaelshirkin.com. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.